market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, President Trump says Venezuela will send as much as 50 million barrels of oil to the U.S., worth up to $2.8 billion. In a post on Truth Social, the president said the oil would be sold at market price with the funds controlled by him. Well, we're now joined this morning by Katharine Neiss, Chief European Economist at PGIM Fixed Income, Stephanie Baker, Bloomberg Senior Writer. But first, to Will Kennedy, our oil expert and Bloomberg News Director for EMEA. This is huge, Will, because actually it was unclear. I mean, is this stuff that they already had? Because you can't pump it fast enough and then bring it to the U.S.
Like so many things Trump says, it's a very dramatic announcement, but the details and how it will actually work are a little bit unclear. But it's an illustration that Trump clearly expects a dividend for what he's done in Venezuela, and he means it when he says he's very interested in Venezuelan oil. And here is evidence that he actually wants to bring some of that oil to the United States. 50 million barrels, as you say, worth $2.8 billion at current market prices. How that will actually happen, when it will actually happen, is a little bit unclear. One thing that we do know going on in the ground is because of the blockade, the quarantine of sanctioned oils, as the US puts it, oil that might be going to China, for example, tanks are filling up very fast in Venezuela, and there will be a need to get oil out of the country. We don't know if it's related, but we've seen this flotilla of 11 tankers booked by Chevron yesterday to export oil from Venezuela, which I think shows that there is a need to get the oil out of the country.
OK, so you get the oil out, maybe 50 million barrels. What happens after that? Because you need a new infrastructure. And I imagine if you're a chief executive of Chevron Exxon, you don't know what happens next. You don't know if there's political stability. And you probably don't want oil prices that much lower.
Yeah, I mean, longer term, it's going to be very difficult to achieve what Trump clearly wants to achieve, which is dominance over Venezuela's oil industry. That presumably would be achieved through companies like Chevron, which is the one remaining U.S. oil company in Venezuela, perhaps Exxon and Conoco, who have been there in the past. But to persuade those companies to be there, they're going to need an awful lot of certainty about the political future in Venezuela, and that's entirely unclear. To revive Venezuela's oil industry, to make it fulfill its potential, is going to cost tens of billions of dollars. And to invest that money, you're not going to be certain that it's not going to be expropriated again, that you're going to have some kind of political stability going well into the 2030s.
Will, thank you so much. Will Kennedy, our Bloomberg News Director for EMEA. Now, the Trump administration has also reportedly told Venezuela to partner exclusively with the U.S. on oil, sever ties with China, Russia, Iran and Cuba. The White House has also refused to rule out using military force to take Greenland. So let's bring in Katharine Neiss, Chief European Economist at PGIM Fixed Income, and Stephanie Baker, Bloomberg's senior writer and author of Punishing Putin. So we have the geopolitics, and then we'll look at markets and what it all means for fixed income. Stephanie, where are we? There's of course, a lot of anxiousness about what happens next, what happens to Greenland. It's unclear whether they're talking about force. Is this just an emboldened president of the U.S., or do we actually believe what he says and take this seriously?
Well, he's been talking about Greenland since his first term, and there's no doubt that with the actions in Venezuela to take out Maduro, this has come into renewed focus. Secretary of State Marco Rubio told lawmakers yesterday in a closed session that the U.S. was not considering military force to take Greenland, but they were looking at buying it. There's no doubt that Greenland is strategic, given the opening up of the Arctic, but there's no rational reason why the U.S. would need to acquire Greenland. Back to the Cold War era, the U.S. had additional bases in Greenland, and Danish officials have said, we are open to negotiations. If you want more bases, please come. We're open to that. If you want to explore and develop mineral resources, we are also open to that. So I suspect they'll come to some sort of agreement, but there's absolutely no need for the U.S. to go in and invade Greenland. And I think it would obviously create huge disruption within the NATO alliance, because he'd be invading a NATO country, and that would put the actual existence of NATO in threat. So I think they'll probably end up coming to some kind of an agreement.
Katharine, what's interesting is that actually the markets is largely looking through it. I know there's been a bit of movement on oil, but is this because they don't know how to price this, because they don't know what happens next, or it's just it doesn't fundamentally change any of the economics?
Well, it's early days, I would say, firstly, to know fully what is going to be the market reaction. I think initially my thought would have been that, to the extent that this news does mean at the margin increased oil supply on global markets, lower energy prices, but also having sort of demonstrated through this action, yet again, a kind of breaking through some of the norms that I think in previous decades people have come to expect, that this could potentially raise, risk premia further out. So you would, I think, other things equal, I would have expected more of a steepening in curve, so more of a trend that we'd already seen starting in the last couple of years. Maybe for now, the lack of reaction reflects not just the fact that it's early days, but, for example, within Europe, the connectivity between the EU at the EU level and what is happening in Venezuela is fairly limited. But again, there could be issues around lower energy prices, pushing down on near-term inflation, but also raising defense and security issues within Europe that could sort of push up long-end yields.
I mean, there's a couple of movements. Again, they're quite small. I know traders are pairing some of the ECB bets. So I think they see the first chance of a hike in March 2027. You have a brilliant outlook for 2026, which is the markets kind of muddle through, which is what most people feel like in general. Does any of the geopolitics change that?
So a curveball event, which I would say, despite the fact that Venezuela has been in discussion amongst the U.S. administration for some time. I think this was a rather sort of unexpected and dramatic development. I think Europe always sort of experiences the spillover, the aftershocks of these sorts of events. In that sense, they are sort of passengers, if you like. And I think, this latest event does, perhaps sort of underscore the very limited role that Europe has in sort of driving the agenda. But absent that, my sense is that 2026 could be, a bit of a kind of nothing year in some ways for Europe, based on what we know now. And I see 2027 as being a more consequential year. You have a lot of really important elections happening in Europe. We will know the direction of travel for the next 7 years under this new EU multi-year financial framework budget that I think is going to potentially be quite important. Those things could play out in 2027, whereas 2026 is a lot of tailwinds.
What do we think will happen in Ukraine? Can Europe, there was a big meeting at the Elysee yesterday in Paris. Can Europe even kind of rely or trust the U.S.?
Well, they did make progress yesterday in terms of coming up with this coalition, the framework for a coalition of troops to go in and provide security guarantees for Ukraine in the case of a peace deal, with the UK and France offering to commit troops. Macron said it would be a few thousand, but the details are still very vague. And the fundamental problem there is that Putin would reject any deal that involved the deployment of NATO country troops into Ukraine. So I think while that's a good agreement for Ukraine in principle, and it's something that Ukraine has been looking for years, frankly, I don't see that going forward, because I don't think Putin is going to agree to a deal that would involve that, where there's still this thorny issue over territory, this part of the Donbass that Putin has demanded Ukraine hand over, that the Russian forces have been unable to take militarily. And I think that's one of the biggest sticking points in the negotiations. So putting aside the whole issue of whether or not these, British and French troops could go into Ukraine, they would be deployed far from the front line, would be heavily protected, and would be there to support the Ukrainian military. I just don't see how that's going to go forward with Putin not backing down on his maximalist goals of taking all of Ukraine.
And Katharine, we saw again in Venezuela, the U.S. now saying China to back off. They were the biggest buyer of Venezuelan oil. I mean, does this risk actually going back to trade policy and so inflation risks? Again, the markets and the fixed income space have largely looked through the tariffs of 2025.
So I think this is a really great point. The data that we have from the U.S. is either missing or not reliable. So I think the bottom line is we still don't yet really know what is the inflationary impact from tariffs in the U.S. And given the sort of expected lags, the earliest I would have expected to have seen a tariff effect on inflation in the U.S. was probably in Q4 of 2025. Right. We don't really have a clear picture of that data, but this would likely have an extended effect through to 2026. So there was a piece actually that came out today from Gita Gopinath that actually talks specifically about these sorts of lags and that we might, very well expect to see these tariff effects play out. In Europe, of course, the impact is the opposite. It's deflationary because of, competing with Chinese goods on global markets, because of excess capacity, getting diverted to Europe. So there, the risks to inflation are very different than in the U.S., where, if energy prices do come down, it will sort of magnify that downside risk. And we could see this divergence again between the U.S. and the euro area.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to, to a question, is what the Trump administration doing foreign policy, or is it economic policy? Does it, does it also change what they're trying to do with China?
Well, this is where Venezuela gets very complicated, right? Because the majority of Venezuelan oil has been going to China. Russia has been in there, and there were these reports that Russia is escorting a Venezuelan oil ship by submarine to protect it, which the U.S. the U.S. Coast Guard had tried to board and seize. So the U.S. has demanded, Marco Rubio has demanded that Venezuela kick out advisors from Russia, China, Cuba. And I think with Venezuela, the real question is, it does appear that they've done a deal with the now president, Delcy Rodriguez, who was previously Maduro's vice president. And it was all about letting U.S. oil companies in there. And the question is, can she maintain that balancing act of keeping the hardliners within Venezuela, within the Venezuelan military, on her side while cooperating with the U.S. and meeting all of Trump's demands?
I mean, if something goes off, what happens to fixed income? Is there a fixed income space that looks more vulnerable?
To me, it really comes back to this risk premium point. Yeah. Even absent all of these events, if you just look at, it's not an observable thing, but if you look at estimates of it over the long term, it still looks to be relatively compressed. It's something we got used to during the period of extended quantitative easing. But, you layer on all of these, really quite new developments, the potential for further developments that we cannot even imagine. And it strikes me that there is scope there to see a bigger increase in these long end yields through those premium.
Okay, thank you both for joining us. Katharine Neiss, Chief European Economist at PGIM Fixed Income, and Stephanie Baker, Bloomberg Senior Writer and author of Punishing Putin. Coming up, we'll talk to Dominique de Villepin. He's the former Prime Minister of France, who has been critical of French President Macron's reaction to Trump's intervention in Venezuela. We'll talk Ukraine, we'll talk Venezuela. That's next, and this is Bloomberg. The conversations that matter, the insights you need. This is The Pulse, and I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, the former French Prime Minister, Dominique de Villepin, has criticized the French President, Emmanuel Macron, and his reaction to Trump's intervention in Venezuela, calling it blind and irresponsible. While Macron welcomed the fall of Nicolas Maduro's dictatorship, he failed to address the abduction of the former president of Venezuela. That's what Monsieur de Villepin thinks, and he joins me now from Paris. Dominique de Villepin, thank you and welcome to The Pulse. First of all, what do you think of Venezuela and Trump's comments on Greenland? Should he be taken seriously?
Well, of course, I think that all these speeches should be taken seriously, and that's why I think that the European will be well inspired to address a very strong message to the Trump administration. In no cases, Europe should accept any damage to the European sovereignty. And of course, this includes Greenland, Denmark, as part of Europe.
Monsieur de Villepin, what does that mean in terms of what Europe could concretely do? How should they react today? And again, what do you think the U.S. is to Europe?
First, we have to see what will be exactly the move of Donald Trump. Donald Trump could today get everything he wants in terms of possibility to exploit some of the resources of Greenland. There is already a U.S. military basis in Greenland without putting any force. So the willingness to go forward and to attack the sovereignty of Greenland would be a red line for the Europeans. And the Europeans, of course, I believe, should say and would say that in no case they will recognize any U.S. sovereignty on Greenland. It will be an attack on the European soil. It will be a first in the history of the world. For the first time, a democracy, or considered as a democracy, the U.S. will be attacking another democracy. And for the first time, one of the biggest power of NATO will be attacking another country that is part of NATO. So it will be unprecedented. So absolutely unacceptable. It will be a very serious damage to NATO, very serious damage to the EU. So globally, the United States will be attacking their own interest in Europe, damaging the balance of the world.
But, Monsieur de Villepin, is it better for Europe, actually, for the moment to see what happens, because they don't want to aggravate Donald Trump? Again, do you worry that this is the end of NATO, or just by letting it go, a little bit like the tariffs, that there's no retaliation, it settles down?
Well, that's the whole point, Francine. I believe that the Europeans are very careful not to go too far too soon, because they have given the priority to Ukraine. They don't want to damage the European policy in Ukraine, the security of Ukraine. That's why yesterday the agreement in Paris was an important move, even if this agreement on the coalition of the willing with the US to support some important security guarantees is completely depending on the goodwill of Russia. And we know for sure that Russia, till now, does not want to have a ceasefire in Ukraine. So we need to see how far the US is willing to go to put pressure on Vladimir Putin. So everything has, all the effort has still to be made.
A reminder for all of our viewers, the U.S. and Europe say they've made significant progress on security guarantees for Ukraine, also aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. Let's hear from the U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer speaking after a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing in Paris.
And we think we've made a lot of progress. We heard President Zelensky and some of the other people here talking about land options. That will be the most critical issue, and that's subject. And we're going to be continuing on with those discussions, and hopefully we'll be able to meet or come up with certain compromises with regard to that. But I do want to say this. We are here to mediate and help in the peace process, and we're prepared to do anything necessary to get to that place.
This is a vital part of our ironcast commitment to stand with Ukraine for the long term. It paves the way for the legal framework under which British, French and partner forces could operate on Ukrainian soil, securing Ukraine's skies and seas, and regenerating Ukraine's armed forces for the future.
Monsieur de Villepin, do you really think we're getting closer to a peace deal? Do you think Europe can still trust the Americans?
I think we will trust what we see, and we are still waiting for the possibility of the Trump administration to really convince and put all their weight to get an agreement with Russia. We are yet very far from that, and I don't think the Trump administration is already ready to pay the price for an agreement and twisting the arm of of Vladimir Putin, and that's why I believe that the Europeans should not underestimate the need to address a very strong message to Donald Trump that they are not going to be willing to accept any kind of attack on the sovereignty of Greenland. This is a matter of principle for us. And of course, then if Donald Trump goes forward, the status of the US will go from adversary or rival to the one of enemy. It will be a huge historical change. I repeat, never we have seen a democracy attacking the sovereignty of another democracy in all the past centuries. So we have to take all this very seriously.
Monsieur de Villepin, Europe hardly has an army, so would it be empty threats against the US?
Well, it won't be empty threats. The strategy for Europe is very clear. We have to elevate, to upgrade the price that the Trump administration will have to pay if they want to attack, jeopardize the sovereignty of Greenland. Elevate the level in diplomatic terms, in political terms, in terms of military. We have the capacity to have troops on the ground. I don't believe in any case that we should go to war with the US Army. This is not serious. But to elevate the scale of the consequences that the Trump administration will have to pay, I think is absolutely necessary, and Donald Trump should not forget. He has midterm elections in November. I'm not sure that the public opinion in the US will follow Donald Trump in a new adventure, and we should remind the fact that the easy part has been done in Venezuela. It was the military intervention. Now the biggest part is ahead. And the biggest part is how to stabilize the situation in Venezuela, how to organize a political transition. And already we can see that there are important damages to the interest of the US because of this military intervention. The first damage, which is very important, is that it has sent a very wrong signal to Russia and to China that they can do whatever they want in their own influence zone. But there are two other very important consequences. The second one is the fact that the whole soft power of the US, which has been gained during a century and more than a century, every single people in the world were full of admiration for the American culture, the American way of life. And all this is jeopardized by the policy of Donald Trump.
Monsieur de Villepin, thank you so much. We'll have to get you back on because also, Monsieur de Villepin, we'll book you back on. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top headlines. Oil falls as President Trump says 50 million barrels of Venezuelan crude is being shipped to the U.S. Caracas has also reportedly been ordered to partner exclusively with the U.S. on oil production. The White House refuses to rule out using military force to seize Greenland. I'll be speaking to the vice chair of Denmark's Foreign Policy Committee shortly. Plus, Nvidia plays down fears of an AI bubble, saying orders are bigger than expected. But rival AMD falls despite saying that demand is soaring. Now, just a short while ago, we were speaking to the French former Prime Minister, Dominique de Villepin. He's still with us. Monsieur de Villepin, you were talking about the fact that this changes everything, actually, after what happened in Venezuela over the weekend. And the point is that you worry that the world is much more unstable. What else do you worry about?
Well, in no way I will support the rotten regime of Nicolas Maduro, which has suffered so much the Venezuelans. But we have to take into account the fact that this move and this violation of international law is going to be seen by many countries around the world as an incentive for nuclear proliferation. So a more unstable world also for a last factor, because it is be seen in South America as a move of recolonization. And this is going to fire a very strong nationalist, anti-imperialist move in South America against the U.S. So the U.S. should be very careful on their next move. I know that the Trump administration is talking about Cuba, about Nicaragua, why not Colombia? I don't think they should consider that the governments, but much more than the governments, the people of this region can be played with. They have a very strong nationalist sentiment, and this has to be taken very seriously.
Monsieur de Villepin, you floated the idea of being a candidate in 2027 for the French presidential election. Have you made up your mind? If not, when will you, and what would make you go for it?
Well, the election in France, the presidential election, is in 16 months, so still very far away. But the national situation in France, which gives the far right way ahead of all the other parties, as well as the instability of the world and the risk to have the far right winning all over Europe with the strong offensive of the Trump administration. We all remember the speech of J.D. Vance in Munich, mentioning the fact that the policy of regime change could be applied to Europe. And that's a good reason for me to believe that we should fight very strongly for democracy, for our values. And that's why I want to be part of this election and be a strong voice and acting very strongly to make sure that liberal democracy will still exist in Europe in the coming years.
So you will be a candidate?
I'm not saying that because, again, this is not the moment to announce that, but my party, the France Humaniste, will be part of this important combat, and my determination is very strong.
Monsieur de Villepin, thank you so much for joining us. That was the former French Prime Minister Dominique de Villepin. Now, on to tech stories. And Nvidia says that an upbeat revenue forecast delivered in October has only become brighter due to strong demand. AMD shares falling even after the chief executive said demand is soaring. With us now is Bloomberg's EMEA tech editor, Shana Ghosh. Shana, thank you for joining us. Investors are brushing off comments by Lisa Su. Why?
Good morning. So I think the important context here is that AMD's shares, the price has doubled. Or risen at a pace sort of double that of Nvidia's. And Nvidia is the market leader here in terms of chips that can power artificial intelligence models. AMD is the competitor, but its share price has risen about 77% over the past 12 months. Nvidia comparatively is 33% or so. So when you take that into account, investors may be feeling like, look, maybe we've hit the peak for AMD. You know, maybe it's time to cool off a bit. So it may be a sort of natural response to this broader sense that maybe the AI stuff is a bit overhyped.
Data center cooling companies have fallen. Nvidia said its latest chip won't need them. Is that a sign that the AI bubble doesn't pop, or are there still winners and losers?
There's winners and losers, and, you know, there's a saying, right, in a gold rush, sell the shovels. And this is a case where the cooling companies have been the shovels up till this point. Again, some of these cooling companies like Johnson, Modine, Trane, their share prices have risen hugely over 2025. So this is a paring back of those gains. Overall, they're still kind of up. And it's just a case that as technology develops, you know, the chips themselves become more efficient, maybe demand drops a little and you see a cooling in that sentiment, but it doesn't mean that their business is going away entirely.
As Samsung is also warning of chip shortages, how do tensions over rare earths play into this?
Yeah, so the rare earth shortage, the restrictions from China are probably going to be an issue for companies all along the chip supply chain, not just Samsung. And the company has warned, you know, look, the restrictions mean that the prices are rising for these minerals, and that likely means higher prices in the medium to long term for chips. Don't think we're seeing shortages just yet, but we're likely to see a rise in prices, and in the long term that may impact consumers.
Shona, thank you so much for joining us. Bloomberg's EMEA tech editor, Shona Ghosh. Now, nickel has retreated after surging to a 19-month high. It's a reversal of fortune for the metal that has been plagued by oversupply concerns. Nickel, which is used in batteries and stainless steel, has joined other base metals in making a strong start to 2026. Well, joining us now is Michael Widmer, head of metals research at Bank of America. Thank you for joining us. Now, we'll get on to some of the bullion and everything that in between. But actually, what are metals now? It feels like it's a foreign policy play from the U.S. Do you have to revisit, like almost metal by metal, what the U.S. wants and what it can have?
It's interesting that you say that, but yes, for some of the metals, you certainly can say that. I think take copper, for instance. I think that's probably the best example. So there was an announcement of tariffs. Traders shipped a lot of copper to the US market. Tariffs did in the end not happen, but because we had this dump of metal, the market got very dislocated, and you can finance these metals profitably now. So in a way, you almost have a copper reserve now already in the US on the back of the policies. And then I think looking at everything that has been said in the previous two commentaries, I think the uncertainty that you have in the global economy added another dimension, I think, to the precious metals. Gold and silver, I think, are to some extent benefiting from all of that at the moment. So
if we just focus on copper for a second, because the rally has been absolutely extraordinary. How much of the most recent rally is about the fundamentals, supply deficits that the market may have been pointing to for a while, and how much of it, as you seem to suggest, is it on tariff trade pulling inventory into the U.S.?
It's a bit of both. I mean, the deficits are real, right? We've been talking for years about the lack of mine supply. We actually have shortages at the moment. But again, these trade disputes that pulled a lot of metal into the US and make it locked up there, that metal is effectively missing now outside the US. And I think that's where some of that strength in prices is now coming from. So it's still fundamental, right? It's not that the market is completely out of fact. It's something that is a reality of metal flows, and the market prices accordingly.
Michael, gold, I mean, again, bullion, the best year since 1979. It was up some 65% last year. Is it now too crowded for more investors to come in, or is it just trying to pull away from the U.S., so it'll just go up and up?
Look, overbought but underinvested. I think that's what we basically say. But we've been bullish for the last $2,500 per ounce. And initially we were bullish because of concerns of the U.S. fiscal deficit, U.S. debt. And then since then you have added dimension after dimension that actually extended the rally. And rallies normally don't come to an end because the market is overbought. Rallies normally come to an end because the drivers that took people into the market initially have subsided. And for now, actually, I don't see that. We have to look maybe later this year, midterm elections and all of that, whether there is some change. But for now, I think it still looks good. There's pockets of the market that is still unallocated.
So what's your base case for gold at $5,000 an ounce for 2026? What's the biggest risk to that bold bullish call?
Look, the biggest risk, I think, is that some of those speculative flows, as we've come out of the market, we've seen that late last year, right? You had prices coming off very, very hard on a reset of expectations. And I think that, I would say, coming back to the overbought theme is potentially one of the biggest risks that you have at the moment.
What do you think central banks will do? Will they continue buying gold this year?
Yeah, I think they will. I think, and this is one of the themes that has been very important for the market. I think the fragmentation that you do see in the global economy at the moment, at the closing of the U.S. economy, effectively the balancing of the external accounts makes the traditional trade of buying dollars that the U.S. puts into the economy and recycle them into U.S. treasuries more difficult. And so central banks, if they want to diversify the reserves, there is not all that much that they can do. And gold is really the one metal or the one asset that benefits from that. Just to give you an idea, when you run a portfolio optimization exercise for an average emerging market central bank, you can justify them holding around 30% of their assets in gold. Right now we are at 15%. So there is still,
China? I mean, how much does China have, and how much more can they get to try and get away from the U.S.?
I think there's two stories to that. I think China has had a very long-term strategy initially to develop the gold industry, and I think now there's also that diversification perspective. But we're also seeing that China wants to play a bigger role in the gold market, effectively inviting central banks to deposit gold in China. And I think on the basis of that, I would expect that the Chinese will remain strong participants in the gold market going forward.
Michael, I mean, we've also seen some quirky moves in the gold to silver ratio. What does that actually tell us?
I think silver is catching up at the moment. That's one thing. We've had deficits in the silver market for the best part of the past 5 years, and prices for a long time didn't move. And I think you now have a lack of liquidity. That means that anyone who wants to come into the market and purchase silver really has to pay up for that. We have good demand still from solar panels. We have good demand from the EVs as well. But there is also a speculative element in there, I think, and that's something that is worth following, I would say. I think the memification of silver, I think, is a potential concern that I have.
Concerns because at some price it basically hurts, the industrial demand for it.
I mean, some of the volatilities that we have, that one thing, but some of the volatilities that we have are not healthy. When you're looking at platinum, right, we have almost 100% realized vol at the moment. It's just not really good for the market.
I mean, what's the impact that Venezuela has on your world longer term? Is it difficult to quantify?
No, I think on the precious metal side, particularly when you're looking at gold, it's just plays into that whole theme that I've described before, and I think that's why I'm saying I'm unwilling to alter our bullish call unless some of that changes. And for now, I think rather than actually taking some of those bullish factors away, we're actually adding them.
Michael, because of all this news, actually, we also forget that there's a bit of a feud between China and Japan. And we thought that they would overlook it, but actually it just seems to be deepening a touch. Yeah. What's the impact of that on metal?
That's relatively more limited. I think, as you said, I think the market has potentially forgotten a little bit about that, given everything else that is happening in the world at the moment. But again, that is the world that you have to deal with at the moment, where some of those long-standing certainties that you've had are just not around anymore. And that's, I think, where we're looking at it from a portfolio allocation perspective. Again, coming to gold and silver, where some of the investors that are not exposed to gold and silver are saying, look, maybe it's worth adding just a little bit something to the portfolio.
Michael, thank you so much. Michael Widmer there, the head of metals research at Bank of America. A very busy man, given everything that's been going on. Coming up, Denmark requests a meeting with the U.S. Secretary of State to clear up any misunderstandings over Greenland. We'll be joined by the Deputy Speaker of the Danish Parliament next. This is Bloomberg. The conversations that matter, the insights you need. This is The Pulse, and I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, the U.S. president has made acquiring Greenland a national security priority, with the White House refusing to rule out taking it by military force. So why is the Danish territory so important to Donald Trump? Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden has more.
Roughly 3 times the size of Texas, Greenland sits at a strategically important location in the North Atlantic and Arctic. It has vast stores of critical minerals and fossil fuels coveted by the US and its strategic rivals China and Russia. Buried beneath the ice sheets, climate change has made those resources more accessible than ever. And the thawing ice has opened up new trade routes between North America, Europe and Asia. Greenland is already home to the US's northernmost airbase and a radar station that's used for detecting missiles and monitoring space. Gaining control over Greenland could give the US government new opportunities to expand its military presence in the Arctic, as well as access to critical materials to build the economy of the future without relying on the likes of Beijing.
Lizzie Burden there reporting on the very latest now. Denmark and Greenland have requested a meeting with the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Danish media have quoted Denmark's foreign minister as saying he wants to clear up some of the misunderstandings that may exist. Now, he was speaking after a meeting of Denmark's Foreign Policy Committee, and the committee's vice chair, Lars-Christian Brask, joins us now. Mr. Brask, thank you for joining us today. First of all, what do you make about the latest questions and the latest thoughts from the President of the United States? When there's threats of possible military action, should Denmark take him seriously?
Of course, we have to take it seriously when it's the president of the U.S. that speaks. But that said, I also think some common sense must be applied. We've been a partner with the U.S. for more than 80 years. We have helped them in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and actually I think the Danish military lost most soldiers per population of any in those wars, helping the U.S. The U.S. is a partner, it's an ally, and you don't go blue on blue. One NATO country doesn't go and require territory of another NATO country. It's unheard of and it's disrespectful.
I mean, your government has requested a meeting with Marco Rubio. What do you hope to achieve?
As our foreign minister has said and also told us yesterday, the foreign minister of Greenland and the Danish foreign minister have requested a meeting with Rubio, and there we will get facts right. Some higher-ranking U.S. personnel has said that there's 30,000 people on Greenland. There's 57,000. U.S. has had 17 bases in Greenland, and not many years ago we spoke to the administration and I think actually the president as well, and asked, what do you need? Do you need more? Do we need to keep the infrastructure going? What is needed for the U.S.? And there was no demand for extra bases at that time. So sort of to clear out some of the misunderstandings, also that Greenland is surrounded by Chinese and Russian ships, etc., etc. And the opportunities that are there for the U.S. In terms of bases and rare earth or rare minerals.
There was an emergency meeting in the Foreign Policy Committee yesterday. What was the outcome of that meeting?
It is totally secret what is discussed in that meeting, and sometimes the agenda is not even public. But the agenda that was public, or part of the agenda yesterday, was the discussions about the relationship to the U.S. And the outcome of that, or at least what is official from that meeting, is that our foreign minister, the Danish foreign minister, and the Greenlandic foreign minister will go or have requested a meeting with Rubio in Washington, D.C.
Sir, are people nervous in the government? Is it nervousness? Are you emboldened? What's the kind of mood music? Do you think there's any possibility of a deal on anything being struck with the U.S.?
Well, people are nervous. We haven't experienced this before, and certainly not from an ally. So, of course, there's uncertainty, nervousness, to some extent anger. But will there be found a resolution? I hope so. And it will start with a meeting with the two foreign ministers and Rubio in Washington, D.C.
What do you think NATO should do or say now? It's been a little bit silent so far.
Yeah, we've had lots of support from leaders of states and like Nordic Council that I'm chairman of for the Danish part has also come out with statements basically saying this is not on. But we haven't heard much, as you say, from NATO. Mark Rutte could come out with a statement basically saying how it works and how it certainly doesn't work in NATO in terms of acquiring, in inverted brackets, land from each other.
Do you think that would focus the minds, or is there a danger that it escalates?
I think dialogue always helps. I think Churchill said, speak jaw to jaw, it's better than war, or something to that extent. Dialogue is always the way forward to de-escalate situations and to clear uncertainties and misunderstandings.
Mr. Brask, I've had a number of viewers trying to comment and email saying, why is there not a referendum in Greenland about who they want to belong to? And what do you say to that?
Well, at the end of the day, Greenland decides on the future of Greenland. So Greenland can decide that they want to be part of the US, or they want to continue to be part of Kingdom of Denmark. And I think in that is also the problem, because when Greenland very clearly announced that they wanted to be totally independent at one point. Then somebody woke up in Washington, D.C. and said, wow, that's a big threat to our geopolitical situation. This big landmass run by, populated by 57,000 people. We have to look into that. So I think the key thing for Greenland to do is to decide, we want to stay within Kingdom of Denmark. We might modernize how we work together, or an alternative route, and then we will look at that when that potentially can be on the table.
Mr. Brask, I know there's so much uncertainty out there at the moment, but in terms of timeline, how do you expect events to go? How quickly do you think, we would get something from either a statement from NATO and then that meeting with Marco Rubio and things quieten down? Or how critical are the next 2 weeks?
No, the next 2 weeks, they're critical. But let's get the meeting with the 3 foreign ministers together, clear up the misunderstandings, try to understand what it is everybody wants to achieve. And then I'm sure we are more informed and there's less misinformation after that meeting.
Do you know if your government has spoken to NATO to maybe ask for a statement or something like that?
That I don't know.
Okay, Mr. Lars-Christian Brask, Vice Chair of Denmark's Foreign Policy Committee and Deputy Speaker of the Danish Parliament, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, to some other top stories that we're also following this morning. Hyundai Motor shares have soared in the Asian session on speculation that a meeting between the firm's executive chair and Nvidia's CEO might signal a deeper relationship emerging between the two companies. Well, South Korean news outlets said the meeting could be an indication of cooperation on autonomous driving. The discussions would have taken place immediately after Nvidia unveiled its new AI autonomous driving platform, Alpamayo, at CES. Well, Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang says he is not concerned about a billionaire's tax under consideration in his home state of California. The world's 9th richest person says he's, quote, perfectly fine with it. Under a proposed ballot initiative in the state, billionaires would face a one-time 5% levy to cover funding shortages for health care, food assistance, and education. And Elon Musk's xAI has completed a $20 billion funding round with investors, including Nvidia and the Qatar Investment Authority. xAI says the financing will accelerate infrastructure build-out and develop AI products. That includes its chatbot Grok, which has caused alarm among some regulators for allowing users to generate images of people undressed by AI without their consent. Okay, let's also have a very quick look at the markets. There is a lot going on today. We've been focusing definitely on a lot of the geopolitics. The record-breaking global stock rally has been losing momentum after a sharp run-up. Seems to have left markets showing signs of overheating. I know there's going to be a lot of traders that so far have largely shrugged off geopolitical risks, that may be more interested in U.S. economic data on the labor market and business activity due a little bit later this week. So that could test some of the optimism on the markets. Up next, Bloomberg Brief, and this is Bloomberg.